Foundation in 1987. Each year, 20 rising juniors are given the opportunity to participate in a 2-year course of study designed to prepare them for graduate school and to pursue a career in college or university teaching.
During their junior year, they take the History of Ideas 1 and 2, and in their senior year, a colloquium with the Dean of Faculty. They do research during the summer of their junior year and then publish their work in the Eckerd Scholar.
We wish to thank President Eastman for his strong support, Dean Harrison, who teaches the Senior Ford Colloquium, and Carolyn Johnston, our professor for Junior Ford, who has been in the program since its beginning. We also wish to honor Dr. Lloyd Chapman and Peter Pav, who contributed immensely to the program and for decades. We are also very grateful to Dawn Ellenberg and to the Eckerd ITS.
At this time, we'd like to have the new Ford Scholars and their sponsors stand to be recognized. This year, we're concerned with the need to reawaken the best parts of education and bring a new hope to the modern world. Tonight's papers will discuss this reawakening of higher education from the political sphere to the modern zoo, and even the need to reawaken the way that we use education in our own academic field. Each paper is concerned with the potentials for education to overcome the challenges that we must wake up and face in academia and the wider world that it can influence. We hope you enjoy.
Shannon will now introduce our first speaker.
Our first speaker this evening, Joy Vincent, hails from the great state of Colorado, like myself. Joy and I actually met when we were volunteers at the Denver Aquarium together. We would spend hours wandering through the displays and exhibits, and who would have known that the time we spent offering facts to guests outside the tiger enclosure would plant the seeds in Joy's mind for her profound reflection on the role of zoo education. By the end of our senior year of high school, we both discovered we would be attending Eckerd College. Here at Eckerd, Joy pursues her studies in psychology with minors in biology and environmental studies. She spends most of her time out on the water with XR, and when she can, spends time under it scuba diving. Joy loves traveling and spending time with her favorite animal of all, the elephant. Joy always brings her smile and unique perspective to Ford. She is an absolute joy to have in class. Please join me in welcoming Joy Vincent.
Thank you, Shannon. Bob and Young once said that in the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. This is a sentiment echoed throughout the zoological and environmental communities as a whole, and demonstrates the exceptionally important link between education and conservation. Zoos are particularly important educational institutions because, unlike universities, they provide extraordinary learning opportunities for people of all ages and are they are more accessible to these people. Without zoos, there would be limited interest in animals and their conservation, topics that many universities strive to teach. They further provide an outlet through which otherwise uninterested patrons can learn about the environment and be exposed to conservation messages. The mission statements of modern zoos are decidedly education-oriented, with a daily focus on increasing public awareness of the plights of the animals in their care. This initiative is relatively novel, and in 1968, Bob and Young was vastly ahead of his time, as zoos were only beginning to shift their missions from one of entertainment to the others of focusing on education and the prolonged conservation of the animals in their care. Zoos are an increasingly important institution in society aimed at informally educating the masses about conservation and environmental awareness. Each year, zoos accredited by the American Zoo and Aquarium Association welcome nearly 140 million people through their gates, which is nearly half the population of the United States. This provides an incredible platform from which zoos can educate the public about various conservation messages. The main function of zoos is to create empathy for various species, and captivity provides a dynamic situation in which people can truly immerse themselves in a species and become interested in its preservation. Zoos and their education messages have historically focused on school groups, particularly with younger students. Since the overhaul of the zoo mission statements in 1970s, this seemingly monotone view of the education process has similarly been reformed to focus on patrons of all ages. Education departments at zoos have deliberately shifted their agendas to focus more on family groups as opposed to simply school groups, as the former makes up more than 80% of the patrons that visit them. There is, however, still a clear influence placed on educating children. A 2003 study indicated that children who are not exposed to animals and environmental issues at an early age tend to form attitudes towards such topics that are less favorable than their counterparts who were exposed to these topics through institutions such as zoos. Therefore, children continue to be an important demographic to cater to in zoo educational messages. A mutually beneficial construct that has been implemented at zoos is inducing parents to be informal interpreters for their children. As they read signage to their children, they are themselves actively interacting with the information and positively portraying the messages. This allows for the encoding of the information in their minds, and it also creates an important link between their children and the given messages. While zoos are an important educational institutions demonstrating partiality for educating school groups, there has historically been limited interaction between higher education institutions and zoological facilities. Zoo education has been mainly focused on children in the primary school levels and their families, with very little emphasis placed on students at the university level. However, this has been changing in recent years as collaboration with universities has become more commonplace. Both institutions share the same goals of educating those in their attendance. Collaboration between zoos and universities can have multifaceted benefits. Zoos are able to provide students with relatively controlled settings in which research can be conducted that both inform zoos on the animals in their care and can also lead to conservation through the knowledge of these various species. Academic research at zoos provides keepers with valuable information about their animals and gives them access to willing volunteers to conduct varied projects with the animals. Additionally, by including college students in research projects, it indirectly educates them about the animals and conservation, while instilling in them a desire to continue the pursuit of knowledge with other students and colleagues. The education of students in the context of zoos has always been important. It is just that now, as research is becoming a primary goal for both institutions, that education of both younger and older students is shifting the focuses of zoos. The indirect implementation of parents as informal educators and the inclusion of university students in research and conservation are not the only routes that zoos have taken to better educate the public about the animals in their care. They have also redesigned animal enclosures to better reflect the natural histories of these animals and species, which also dynamically engages the public in educational messages. The most recent enclosures are well suited for public interaction and education, drawing people into the animals' natural environments, which may lead to better understanding of the corresponding educational messages. The ability to observe and engage with the animals is an important facet of zoo education. However, there is often a disconnect between what people expect from experiences at zoos and what they actually observe. The prevailing impression that people have about wildlife is dictated by media, which condenses the life of animals into short, vibrant films that cut out the mundane portions of their lives that's otherwise characterized by sleep and inactivity. Due to the inundation of high-intensity nature documentaries, people are often left wanting more from their interactions with zoo animals. In order to combat this perceived letdown, zoo educators supplement the lack of activity with stories. about the various species. Stories are uniquely able to move people at an emotional level and allow them to cultivate empathy for the animals. A 2007 study indicated that the most effective way to engage with the public is to tell patrons stories about or introduce them to specific animals at the zoo. This more personalized approach enhances the bond that people feel between them and the animals at the zoo. And this bond fosters learning and appreciation for the struggles that the species is facing in the wild. A common sentiment amongst zoo professionals is that guest interaction is the most influential factor in their engagement with the educational message. The hallmark of modern environmental education is to show photos of cute animals coupled with easy-to-understand statistics about population levels and threats. However, this is not an accurate portrayal of the harsh realities that many animals face. There has in recent years been a push to shift conservation messages to ones that carry an impressive shock factor and an uncomfortable level of unadulterated truth. This approach, however, has not really been picked up by very many zoos, with most of them opting to focus on leaving their guests with a more uplifting message. Even when people are provided with hopeful and uplifting messages, however, they tend to overlook the relationship between their lives and the abstract conservation issues at hand. Zoos do a wonderful job of taking an abstract library element and breathing life into it by exhibiting living animals to the public. But conservation issues are still an intangible concept to which people can't quite relate. By focusing on the ways in which people can alter their lives to bring about positive change, it can form a cognitive link between them and the actions and impacts that they have on the environment. This shift in education more about the problem towards education about possible solutions is not the only way in which zoos can truly create this lasting impact. In 2002, Stoinski and colleagues found that although guests may experience immediate shifts in their conservation mentalities, very few will actually act upon these thoughts once they leave the facility. Suggestions for combating this problem include providing guests with opportunities that are on-site that promote conservation, along with providing possible activities to do once they have left the facilities. As previously stated, the welfare of the animals in their care is of paramount importance to those at the zoo. There is a good deal of controversy that surrounds animal captivity and the role of zoos, as many people continue to perceive zoos as mainly entertainment institutions, as opposed to the educational centers that they have come to be in recent years. An aspect that many people fail to notice when scrutinizing zoos is the role and advancements in the understanding of the animals in their care. There are various avenues of research, including the effectiveness of different management styles, analysis of stress hormone levels, and tests of cognitive abilities of various species. This information is nearly impossible to obtain in a field setting, and zoos provide countless resources to scientists in the expanding field of comparative research. These institutions also provide meaningful experiences and opportunities for university students who are interested in pursuing a career in an animal-related field. This type of collaboration is still in its relative infancy, but has shown positive effects for students and animals alike. But more importantly, it has impacted those uninvolved in higher education through the spreading of conservation messages. Data obtained from studies at zoos have helped to address many conservation-related issues and have informed on better care and management in wild populations. Although there is significant research surrounding education at zoos and what has the most impact on patrons, there is still quite a bit that is not known about zoo interaction with society. The one finding that continues to show consistent results is guest interaction with the animals. Empathy for an animal is the basis of the conservation drive that people experience. Additionally, education only works if people are willing to experience and be present for it, to engage with it. As society continues to evolve, it's hopeful that people will recognize the merits that zoos play in the continued education of society and will be awakened to the role of the modern zoo in conservation education. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for that enlightening paper. It is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ciaran Fitzpatrick. Ciaran is a dedicated student who has set a new standard for interdisciplinary study. With his 2 majors in molecular biology and international relations and global affairs,
Spanish, and chemistry. But Ciaran isn't just a nerd. When he does leave the library, he enjoys activities like listening to music, scuba diving, and spending time in the great outdoors. Ciaran is originally from Kansas City, Missouri, but his interests in issues of poverty, inequality, and food security have taken his concerns global. When Ciaran speaks in class, you can always hear his sincerity and his desire to make the world a better place. Ciaran's logical nature always recenters our class discussion to the real world, providing anecdotes from his experience with friends at home who remind us that the majority of the world does not think necessarily within the politically correct boundaries of a liberal arts education. I truly admire Ciaran's ability to recognize other points of view with compassion without accommodating his own beliefs. His Ford mentor, Dr. Conrad, says that she chose to work with Ciaran because he thinks in the intersection of two worlds. He is creative but scientifically minded. This integrative thinking and passion is what will change the world. She also said she liked his DJing in her lab. That was the real deal breaker. This unique collection of skills is what makes Ciaran such a great leader, both in the classroom and out. I can say I'm genuinely excited to see where Ciaran will go in this world. I know that where you lead, others will follow. And in the same vein, I hope that our political system follows Ciaran's ideas for reform in STEM education of politicians. It is my pleasure to introduce Ciaran Fitzpatrick, presenting his paper, Politicized Science.
I'd like to start with an introductory anecdote. The United States Congress's membership includes only 5 self-identified scientists, and fewer than 10% of all congresspersons have any form of college degree in STEM fields. In contrast, Congress includes 206 members who previously practiced law and 207 members who have backgrounds in business. The clear lack of congresspersons with any higher education in STEM fields or professional backgrounds in the natural and hard sciences does not bode well for the representation of scientific knowledge in the United States government. Fortunately, there are congressional committees that are delegated to specific topics so that Congress can give more critical thought and expertise to relevant issues. Unfortunately, both the Senate Committee of Commerce, Science, and Transportation and the House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology also consist of very few members with any kind of higher education in the hard sciences. However, the chairpersons of the committees have the greatest power in deciding committee agendas and determining which issues are brought before Congress in the form of bill proposals. Consequently, Chairman Thune has a degree in business administration, and Chairman Smith has a law degree. Perhaps you're asking yourself, why should scientists be lawmakers? Shouldn't they be scientists? Well, science is as important to effective government as law and economics are. The importance of an empirical understanding of the natural world to the legislative process has been acknowledged by the United States government for years. The National Academy of the Sciences was formed so that the most current scientific knowledge could be properly used to inform lawmakers' decisions. However, Congress's inability to either understand or properly use information provided by scientific inquiry has become embarrassingly obvious. Misinformation has been sown across the political landscape, and legislators shamelessly politicize scientific hypotheses and theories to advance their agendas. As an example, in my paper, I discussed a recent hearing held by the House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, which is titled Climate Science: Assumptions, Policy Implications, and the Scientific Method. The hearing shows the widespread scientific illiteracy in Congress, as well as the fierce politicization of empirical experimentation. I do not take either side of the climate change issue here. I'm simply pointing out the issues that scientific illiteracy creates in the lawmaking and policy formation process. First, it is worth mentioning that the National Academy of the Sciences, the organization is formed specifically to inform the United States government on scientific knowledge, has a position on the climate change issue. The Academy asserts that global climate is rising in temperature, almost certainly as a result of greenhouse gases caused by human activity. Before a single word could be said, the circumstances surrounding the hearing made it clear that those who opposed actions to mitigate climate change would have the greatest influence on the matter. regardless of scientific evidence. The name of the hearing clearly insinuates that climate science revolves around assumptions and questionable adherence to the scientific method. Of the 4 witnesses that were called to speak during the proceedings, 3 were brought to provide testimony against the merits of popular climate science. Meanwhile, only 1 scientist was called to speak in favor of climate science principles that are accepted most widely by climate scientists, scholarly journals, and scientific organizations. Notably, the witnesses called to refute the urgency of climate policy are the same witnesses that are consistently called by Congress to weigh in on the issue. Both of those realities, however, are dwarfed by the fact that the committee chairperson and majority party typically show no signs of breaking from party positions on an issue that is typically presented as a political conversation rather than a scientific one. In fact, both parties show fierce politicization on the climate change issue, and whichever faction has the most influence over the committee is most likely to control the debate. The chairman of the committee, Lamar S. Smith, opened with a statement that would seem quite reasonable outside of the sphere of politics. Today, quote, "Today, we will examine the scientific method as it relates to climate change. We must ensure that the underlying science that informs policy decisions is based on credible scientific methodology." The seemingly innocent statement hides a problem with the proceedings of a hearing about climate change. Instead of holding a hearing to discuss policies related to climate change, the committee circumvented the issue by holding a hearing to evaluate the scientific method. While it is vital to ensure that the information presented before committee members is reliable, the implication that representatives are qualified to give lectures about the scientific method to scientists with doctorate degrees is a laughable farce. Through his opening statement, he made it clear that he would be maintaining the position that most climate science is not to be trusted. As a whole, the hearing took the typical route of most climate change debates. The Republicans framed climate change as an issue of inconclusive science, and the Democrats framed it as an accepted truth due to the widespread acceptance of human-caused climate change in the scientific community. Despite these arguing points, the hearing's discussion did not follow the path of scientific inquiry and focused only minimally on actual data. Instead, the debate proceeded in a method more familiar to the political sphere, the art of defamation. Much of the hearing was focused most directly on 2 angles. First, Republicans and the witnesses that supported their viewpoint would try to garner sympathy as victims. The witnesses feigned deep offense that man, the witness who supports popular climate science, would label them as climate change deniers. Broad-shouldered Republican representatives would gently coddle their 3 witnesses' hurt egos and scornfully shake their fingers at man for being so unkind. Multiple Republicans and Democrats called for an end to the political partisanship on the issue while they embodied it. The reality is that the committee called in 3 scientists, as well as a 4th witness, with apparent comparative discrepancies between their research. And instead of considering the disagreeing data from an empirical point of view, they simply attempted to prove that their witness was more trustworthy than their opponents. Interestingly, for a hearing that was intended to evaluate climate science according to the scientific method, there was no evaluation of the scientific method at all. Most nods to scientific data were embodied in the form of logical fallacies, such as the climate change hiatus as a definitive proof of global warming's uncertainty. Physicist Bill Foster, one of the few scientists on the committee, brought the most sobering line of questioning to the debate. He clearly laid out the agreements between the witnesses' beliefs with their confirmation. Then he stated where the discrepancies are and attempted to analyze the significance of those discrepancies. Suddenly, he turned a confusing, muddy, and defamatory debate into a practical scientific conversation, as if to prove the point that scientific literacy is necessary for informed decision-making. The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology's hearing on climate change makes 3 things clear. First, it must be considered that not all Congress members are scientifically literate enough to grasp the concepts that expert witnesses deliver. Second, when relying upon expert testimony without the ability to quickly ascertain the meaning of scientific data, lawmakers must take the scientists' assertions at face value. As a result, science becomes severely politicized along party lines, and debates begin to revolve around defamation rather than the scientific data. Third, if most congresspersons are not well adept to scientific protocol, then Congress can, perhaps unwittingly, misuse data and force the corruption of scientific debate. To rectify the lack of scientific understanding in government, colleges and universities must create tracks that more specifically integrate the natural and political sciences. Understanding of the natural world is relevant, even vital, to most legislative debates. Continuing to allow Congress to be blissfully unaware of the scientific implications of their actions is an unacceptable plan of inaction.
Timothy Lee, who is truly one of the most remarkable students that I have ever met. Tim was a molecular bio major with minors in chemistry and French, hailing from Kentucky, where he was homeschooled all the way to Eckerd. In everything he says, it is apparent that Tim's learning reaches far beyond the classroom. This is probably because during his high school years, Tim was actually practically self-taught and was allowed to pursue whatever it was that he felt like studying. Tim is his own best teacher. It has made him one of the brightest students I know, and one who I have learned not only with, but from. I think everyone on the stage would agree that our Ford experience was greatly enhanced by the unique perspective that Tim always offered. He's the only person I know with the impressive ability to connect absolutely anything to both religion and science. And I mean anything. We're probably going to read The Little Prince this week, and he's going to diagnose him with something. Tim's ability to make connections where others don't see them is a constant inspiration. He's the only student that I have ever seen relate a single Latin American novel to quantum physics, unique diseases, the Phantom of the Opera, which he sang, and at least 15 biblical stories. Therefore, if there's anyone I know with a mind innovative enough to tackle the interdisciplinary issues in modern medicine, it is Tim. Tonight, he will explore these issues by addressing the connection between effective dialogue and successful physician-patient relationships. So although I could drag this on forever, it is with great pleasure and admiration that I finally welcome to the stage my friend, Mr. Timothy Lee.
Good evening. Over the past several decades, our educational establishments have started to pay a lot of attention to the teaching style known as dialogic learning as a potential solution to some of the problems that our schools face. As the name suggests, this teaching method is all about dialogue. Basically, in dialogic learning, students and teachers are equal partners in a conversation. They work together by talking through ideas and problems. This concept isn't new. In fact, it borrows a lot from educational traditions going back to Socrates, but it has become fairly popular in recent years. This approach has been tried in a lot of different settings, including liberal arts schools like Eckerd, and research indicates that it often improves learning outcomes, but that it isn't consistently applied in many formal classrooms. So I set out to find whether it works in an informal setting, the doctor's office. Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. I know at this point, everyone in this room who's ever been to see a doctor is thinking, no kidding, of course it works. But the point of all this is to show that it works from the research. That way we can take the conclusions and eventually apply them in changing how doctors are trained. And in fact, a growing body of research does show that when physicians use dialogic learning in their practice, even if it's called by another name, patients are more satisfied with their care, they adhere better to their treatments, and they have measurably better health outcomes. Since the time of early Greek physicians, Western medicine has had as its main objective the health of patients. Physicians commit to using whatever means necessary to improve the patient's health. Clearly, physicians must also have a role as educators as a result of that commitment. They train for years to understand the human body. But most doctors don't get to use that training just to perform procedures. They also have to educate their patients. They have to explain biological concepts, to interpret test results, and to demonstrate procedures that the patients need to do at home. All clearly educational roles. What a physician can do for a patient in one appointment is limited, but what they can teach that patient can make all the difference in their health. And since doctors have this role as educators, it is essential that they communicate effectively. They can't just rely on diagnostic tests or examinations. They have to engage with patients about health issues, goals, and treatment plans. Indeed, the importance of physician communication is underscored by research showing that good communication leads to better patient satisfaction, better treatment adherence, and better outcomes for patients. And it turns out that the communication styles that achieve those benefits are exactly those prescribed by dialogic learning. Things like doctors introducing themselves, making conversation, asking questions, listening, and responding thoughtfully. Over the last 30 years or so, patient satisfaction has become a widely used metric for the effectiveness of care provided by hospitals and doctors. Most patients are asked to fill out a patient satisfaction survey at some point after their appointment. And some evidence suggests that more satisfied patients tend to have better health outcomes. For example, a 2014 study that found that patient satisfaction was inversely correlated with mortality. A great deal of evidence also shows that patients who are more satisfied are more likely to take their medications. Indeed, a 2012 literature review that encompassed over 12,000 patients found a positive correlation between patient satisfaction and treatment adherence. So you can kind of understand the importance of research showing the relationship between physician communication styles and patient satisfaction. A 2004 study showed that doctors at a children's hospital who introduced themselves, listened to patients, and spent time explaining information to patients earned higher satisfaction ratings from the patient's parents. Another study, published in 2008, found that patients who are happy with their doctor's communication were more likely to be satisfied with their care. Clearly, when physicians apply the concepts of dialogic learning to their practice through behaviors such as listening and explaining, patients are generally happier with their care and are likely to experience better health outcomes. In the United States today, primary care doctors generally have about 20 minutes to spend with each patient. So the outcomes of a patient's visit depend very heavily on what the patient does on their own time. Do they attend other appointments? Do they take their pills? That's completely on them. If a patient chooses not to follow the treatment plan that they developed with their physician during the appointment, then their time together may not have any real impact on their health. In fact, a lot of evidence shows that patients often do not cooperate with their treatment plans. For example, studies of adolescents with chronic health conditions show that as many as 50% of them do not take their medication as prescribed. And those are patients with conditions like epilepsy, diabetes, and other very life-threatening conditions. A 2002 study found that more than half of all elderly patients stopped taking their cholesterol medication within 6 months of receiving their prescription. And a 2005 review found that even in clinical trials, in which researchers go to great pains to get patients to take their medications exactly as prescribed, patients sometimes end up taking as little as 43% of their prescribed dosages. That researcher summarized the problem by saying, drugs don't work in patients who don't take them. And this problem has led to treatment adherence becoming an important outcome metric in research. A 2009 review that included over 45,000 patients found a very strong link between physician communication styles and treatment adherence. This extensive body of research clearly demonstrates that when physicians apply the concepts of dialogic learning to their practice by listening, questioning, and explaining, their patients are more likely to take their prescribed medication. But ultimately, the gold standard for studying the effects that changes in an approach to healthcare have on patient health is to measure those outcomes directly. Metrics for this include things like blood pressure, weight, and blood cholesterol levels. There's no substitute for actually measuring direct health outcomes in determining what is best for patients. But measuring these health outcomes can be very difficult and expensive, requiring patients sometimes to come back for multiple appointments, have extra blood tests just to complete the research. So these studies are usually small. However, there is a significant body of literature exploring the effects of physician communication styles on patient health outcomes. And it turns out that when physicians utilize a patient-centered communication style, their patients generally end up being healthier. For example, a 1987 study found that hypertensive patients who were given more opportunity to speak during appointments had lower blood pressure 2 weeks later. A similar 1986 study found that headache patients who felt like they had the opportunity to fully discuss their pain with their doctor were more likely to see that pain resolved within 6 months, regardless of whether or not there was a well-defined medical cause for the pain. A major 1995 review examined those two studies, along with many others, and found that the literature overall supported the idea that when doctors apply dialogic learning techniques in their communication, patients ended up healthier. So given all the benefits shown to follow from good physician communication, you may be wondering, can we teach good communication? Or is this something that some doctors just have and others, let's face it, just don't? Well, thankfully, at least some research exists to answer the question. A large 2016 observational trial of a communication training intervention for physicians found that patients of doctors who received a one-day communication training were more satisfied with their care than those whose doctor did not. A 2013 review of similar studies also found that healthcare professionals who received communication skills training were more likely to ask open-ended questions in later interviews and displayed greater empathy afterwards. Taken together, these studies demonstrate that some of the same benefits attributed to good physician communication can be obtained through relatively minor educational interventions, even among established physicians. So, just a few caveats that are worth noting. Research that I've discussed up to this point has some limitations. Most of the individual studies are pretty small. The subjectivity involved in analyzing and rating individual doctor-patient interactions in audio or video recordings of those appointments makes standardized reporting of results difficult, which could be a problem for the conclusions of the literature reviews, especially the statistical conclusions. And these studies are also generally observational rather than interventional, meaning that they look at different doctors with different patients and try to find differences between them rather than assigning patients randomly to a different sort of intervention to see what the effect of that intervention is. And these studies are generally not randomized or blinded. And that limitation is a reality of the type of research being conducted. Given the available evidence, assigning patients in a randomized trial to work with a nicer, more communicative doctor, or with a less communicative doctor, would probably lead to some patients receiving subpar care. So for ethical reasons, we have to settle for observational studies that can only show correlation. And as the old adage goes, correlation does not equal causation. Without large, randomized, controlled trials, researchers can't say for certain that better communication causes better outcomes rather than that some other factor leads both to good outcomes and to good communication for certain doctors. So clearly this body of research is not conclusive. But despite these limitations, this body of research does seem to support the idea that when physicians communicate better with their patients, treating them as equals and encouraging them to engage as partners in the healthcare process, patients are more satisfied with their care, they're more likely to take their medicine, and they end up being healthier because of it. Clearly, the application of dialogic learning to the doctor-patient relationship is not a panacea to solve all of the American healthcare system's problems, no more than it is to solve all of our educational system's problems. But investment in training physicians to communicate better with patients seems likely to lead to outsized dividends in the health and quality of life of patients. Perhaps, in a healthcare system plagued with challenges, a new hope for better education and better care is to be found not in new technology, but in the oldest of clinical skills, simple human understanding. Thank you.
I have the great pleasure of introducing a peer and a friend I actually met only this year. A Clearwater native raised in New Hampshire, attending Eckerd College brought Ken Tremblay home. He traveled to Thailand for a day with Professor Burnett after freshman year and has been enamored with archaeology ever since. In fact, according to admirers in the classes he assists, He is quite the Scott Burnett 2.0 in the making, mannerisms and intelligence alike. He is an anthropology history double major, and in both disciplines he shines. Ken plans to do his summer Ford research on teeth. It is much, much more complicated than that, but you all can ask him about that later. While you're at it, you should ask him about writing literature reviews, because he loves them. Sampling strategies, not so much. When he isn't shushing people in the library, just kidding, they just work there, Ken is enthusiastically TAing for osteology lab or playing Led Zeppelin on his acoustic guitar. If I could describe Ken in 3 words, I would choose kind, logical, and talented. He is, by every measure, an intellectual. Inspired by his winter term course on pseudoscience, I hope you will give him a warm welcome as he presents his research on higher education in an anti-intellectual era.
In 1963, the American historian Richard Hofstadter wrote a groundbreaking book titled Anti-Intellectualism in American Life in response to the era of McCarthyism rampant just a decade earlier. The attempt to eradicate communism in the United States and the subsequent degradation of that aim to unjustified accusations naturally put educators and intellectuals in the line of fire. But the suspicions and distrust of the intellectual community did not begin there, nor did it end there, but rather anti-intellectualism remains a problem within the United States that greatly affects our politics, our culture, and our lives as participants and aspirants in the community of higher education. In order to understand anti-intellectualism and everything that it entails, it is first necessary to define intellect. Intellect in educational policy circles is set apart from literacy and their expression and context within the goals of the school system. While literacy refers to students' ability to learn basic skills such as reading, arithmetic, and writing, intellect is expansive and critical. According to Hofstadter, intellect is the critical, creative, and contemplative side of the mind. Intellect examines, ponders, wonders, theorizes, criticizes, imagines. Intellect evaluates evaluations and looks for meanings and situations as a whole. For a school then to cultivate intellect within their students, a goal that many schools claim, it is not important for the teacher to recite facts to the students, but to help them to understand the underlying features of society. The teachers are supposed to instruct students not what to think, but how to think. Is a concise example of literacy versus intellect. It becomes a conflict when whether the purpose of schooling is to create thoughtless automatons built to sustain the status quo, or to create critical thinkers with the hope of progress within society. Amy Howley, professor of education studies, comments on this progressive distinction, writing, "Since intellect entails critique, we believe that the intellectual activity of all children will impel them to question the structural elements of society that condition the oppression of some. Many elementary schools are not, as they claim, cultivating intellect within a rising generation, but rather they are part of a capitalistic system in which the goal is to produce obedient and competent workers to fill the shoes of older generations." Howley attempts to explain how primary schools reflect the society at large, and that the schools sort students for the purpose of recreating in each generation the economic stratification of the previous generation. By sorting students according to their background characteristics, they have a vested interest in seeing that a large percentage of the students do not acquire academic competence, let alone develop intellect. By stratifying the students into levels of intelligence, telling them from an early age that they belong in these groups, and making it difficult for mobility between these groups to occur, they can effectively maintain stability in the socioeconomic status of the greater population. The greater education system, or the current education system then, by alienating an elite few for the development of intellect, is a motivator for anti-intellectual thought. In the opening pages of his book, Hofstadter recognizes that creating a definition for the term anti-intellectualism is problematic because of the wide array of ideas and expressions that could be considered against intellectual progress. The loose categorization that he ascribes to the term is that anti-intellectualism is a resentment and suspicion of the life of the mind and those who are considered to represent it, and a disposition constantly to minimize the value of that life. While this definition is necessarily vague, Hofstadter continues later by making the important point that not everyone who holds certain anti-intellectual beliefs is staunchly against progress. As Hofstadter famously said, hardly anyone believes himself to be against thought and culture. Men do not rise in the morning, grin at themselves in the mirrors, and say, "Ah, today I shall torment an intellectual and strangle an idea." People are not anti-intellectual because they do not believe in progress, but rather people have anti-intellectual beliefs for alternative reasons, such as a conflict with their understanding of the universe, or their conception of what information is important and what is not. Lee Schafer added to Hofstadter's interpretation of the intentions of anti-intellectualism and they identified 4 categories within which anti-intellectual thought typically resides. The opposition of research and intellect constitutes a belief that scholarly activity is either trivial and therefore receiving undue support, misguided in the sense of seeking the impossible, immoral, or dangerous. The belief that science is this cold, heartless killer, contrary to warm emotion, could destroy established values, such as love, by knowing too much, is characteristic of anti-intellectual thought for many centuries. Hofstadter and Schafer are writing about American anti-intellectualism in a very different time, however. The 21st century has seen a renewed anti-intellectual movement that has been accelerated by means of technology that is unparalleled in the past. Tom Nichols, in his book, The Death of Expertise, describes humorously, "The foundation of knowledge of the average American is now so low that it has crashed through the floor of uninformed, past misinformed on the way down, and is now plummeting to aggressively wrong." People don't just believe dumb things, they actively resist further learning, rather than just let go of those beliefs. The common disregard of the theory of evolution as just a theory not only illuminates the lack of understanding of epistemology, or how we know what we know, and the scientific methodology, but it is an example of modern-day anti-intellectualism that is affecting our schools, our politics, and our populace. The junk science that appeals to emotion from individuals against vaccines is also emblematic of anti-intellectual ideals, marked by the distrust of scientists with the harmful belief that they are poisoning their children with unnecessary chemicals. The idea that one knows better than the experts about what is best for the health and lives of their children is a relatively new and increasingly dangerous phenomenon. There are many facets that contribute to the increased distrust of intellectuals within our society, including fundamentalism in religion and politics, mass media's hold on the populace and their beliefs and attention spans, and the vast expanse of what can hardly be considered a knowledge on the internet. However, attempting to fix any of these constitute a hopeless approach. Hope lies within the education system. If school systems prioritize the cultivation of intellect within as much of the school as possible, graduates with the ability to think critically will have the tools necessary to progress and protect the society from further anti-intellectual threats. The failure of schools to cultivate intellect in the non-elite students and their compliance to recreating an educational hierarchy that correlates with the socioeconomic hierarchy outside of the school perpetuates more than just a rigid social structure, but a competitive environment between the intellectuals and the lay, as well as a pronounced misunderstanding among the majority of the purpose of science to society. To get some idea of what should be done today to combat these issues, it is important to consider what others have proposed in the past to overcome the public's distrust of the intellectual community. In 1977, Lee Schafer understood that a change in the public's understanding of science and social science would result in a decline in many of the criticisms that are frequently attributed by the public to the intellectual community. The epistemological issue within current anti-intellectual discourse includes actions such as the display of a snowball before Congress to demonstrate that the world is not warmed, while in reality the increased temperature would in turn increase the atmospheric moisture, leading to a wetter year with more snowfall in the winter months. The fact that many people in today's society see science as just another religion, that science is based on the same abstract faith in an idea that superstitious beliefs are, speaks volumes regarding the public's conception of empirical studies. Why there has not been an increase in public understanding of science, however, can be attributed to the lack of standardized education across the country and a lack of effort among intellectuals to engage with the public. Many European countries have standardized curricula that set standards for each individual to be taught the same concepts regardless of geographic location. This is not the case in the United States, where state governments have vied for the ability to create their own sets of curricula, which has resulted in great educational inequality throughout the country as a whole. While a plan like this would be, and has been, difficult to implement, considering the wide range of material that different people deem important to learn, harkening back to the debate of literacy and intellect for primary school goals, having standardized education would help to alleviate the misunderstandings of epistemology throughout the country. A more easily attainable goal is for intellectuals to make the first move, to connect with the public. Nichols writes that many experts, and particularly in the academy, have abandoned their duty to engage with the public. They have retreated into jargon and irrelevance, preferring to interact with each other only. The term ivory tower refers to the privileged elite who are above the reality that the average worker in the real world must face every day. This term has, as of late, been used to characterize the intellectuals who develop their theories about the world and the lives of everybody, but to the public, these ideas have no practical applicability. To dismantle that ivory tower is to begin to dismantle the anti-intellectual problem, the distrust of the mind and those who represent it, to paraphrase Hofstadter. Scientists need to make their work accessible. To take on more projects with an intended audience of non-scientists, intellectuals may introduce scientific ideas as well as the conceptions and processes behind the results in order to increase the understanding and trust between the two very different cultures. While there are certainly difficulties in presenting scientific research in a format fit for consumption while remaining accurate and interesting, the alternative is much bleaker. Thank you.
Our final speaker tonight is Sarah LeFebvre. Sarah is from Nashville, Tennessee, and actually decided to come to Eckerd College after meeting our beloved Professor Johnston during Explore Eckerd. On our Riptide dance team, Sarah is known best for her outstanding facial expressions, and in class we see this same expressivity through her thoughtful writing and engaging discourse. Sarah studies the language of Japanese, and her majors include both history and East Asian studies, altogether giving her an incredibly unique and intersectional worldview. Sarah brings her expertise and experience here tonight as she discusses concerns about the teaching of world history at the university level. She is a true pleasure to have in class every Tuesday, and this week we've decided to share her with all of you. Please welcome our next speaker, last but not least, our friend Sarah LeFebvre.
The field of history is a diverse and often multidisciplinary field of study. Despite the significance and longevity of history, the curriculum at the higher education level requires revamping, a shift from its historical structure. This shift must primarily center on the increase of comparisons, global understanding, and research skills. Such a shift requires moving away from the traditional focus on the history of the United States and other Western countries, and furthering the importance of a history scholar's awareness of the history of world cultures. This paper will focus on the paradigm shift in the late 1990s as colleges and universities slowly introduced world history survey courses. I argue for the increased support of these courses, as well as thorough integration of research skills from the start of a historical education. Such changes will produce historians, regardless of their specialized field, with a more global awareness and a confidence in the methods of historical research. United States and Western civilization survey courses hold a traditional place at the foundation of higher history education. These courses attempt to teach history majors about events, people, and ideas, usually starting in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Greco-Roman world, and following these through Europe and to the Americas. Richard A. Volz claims that the current version of the Western Civilization Survey originated in the 1920s in the wake of World War I, and with the rise of Bolshevism, fascism, Nazism, depression, and World War II, people believed that Western culture needed to be preserved and taught. Although this idea remains valid and important for the foundation of a history major's education, the traditional focus on Western civilization in higher historical education overlooks a significant portion of foundational knowledge for a historian to have, namely the history of the remaining cultures of the world. The victories in the battle for world history at all levels of education are recent and not yet complete. The rise of world history survey courses primarily began in the 1990s and has risen in the past 3 decades. Currently, world history appears more often as optional survey courses, and while this is a victory for the field, many colleges and universities still lack a requirement, and those who have added it sometimes drop it afterwards. For example, the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga added a 3-semester world history survey sequence in the 1999-2000 school year, but then later eliminated this survey in the 2013-2014 academic year due to evolving university and state policies. The elimination of these survey courses undermines the original victory and perpetuates a system of higher historical education overly focused on the West. Much of the pushback against the requirement of world history survey courses arises from supporters of U.S. and Western civilization surveys. At Ciaran University, when attempts were made to shift requirements to include more emphasis on both world and European history, quote, charges were made that this change would Europeanize the department because 12 hours of non-U.S. history surveys were required, whereas only 6 hours of U.S. history work. This accusation highlights the importance of U.S. history at the sacrifice of the history of other cultures and nations. It seems only practical that history students would spend more hours studying the history of non-U.S. countries, which spans thousands of years, than they would studying the 2.5 centuries of U.S. history. The battle for representation of world history at the higher education level should not be seen as a battle against U.S. and Western history, or an attempt to replace these older survey courses. Instead, it is important that world history be taught alongside such surveys, a combination which will continue to enlighten students on Western history through an alternative perspective. The obvious benefit of requiring world history surveys is that history students are exposed to a more global worldview outside of the West-centered education they've most likely received in the past. Volt says, quote, it should move students away from a strictly Christian, Western-focused history and remind them that Americans now operate in a global environment. Western civilization needs to be seen as one of a number of major civilizations and not always the most important, end quote. As vital as it is for students to study history and culture of Western civilizations, they should not study it under the impression that it is the only subject of importance in the history field, or that it exists in a vacuum, disconnected from the history of the rest of the world. In order for history majors to truly understand the West in relation to the rest of the world, and to become globally minded citizens, they must encounter information about other world civilizations. Oppositions to these changes still stand. A large argument against requirements for world history survey courses revolves around the idea that the history of the world is too expansive and therefore cannot be taught successfully. Carol Gluck makes this argument, emphasizing both the broadness of the subject and the problematic way in which history is written by the winners. It would be impossible, therefore, to teach world history without leaving groups out. But does this argument really justify fighting against world history programs? These scholars are valid in their concerns for the groups and historical events that would inevitably be overlooked or misrepresented. But without any form of world history surveys, all of these groups will be overlooked. The all-or-nothing mentality will only hurt higher education history programs in the long run. The inability to include every perfect detail of history should not undermine the opportunity to learn about it in some shape or form. The world history program would evolve over time and include more details as educators learn what needs enhancing. The history of the West is vast in itself and certainly written by the winners, but it still has much more representation in history curricula. World history should not be denied on the same basis. A similar argument places concern in the ability to properly convey aspects of certain cultures. Volt says, quote, another concern about the teaching of world history put forward by East Asian historians is that the field cannot adequately convey the complexities of individual traditions, such as Chinese history that is so complex that it would inevitably be simplified in a survey, end quote. It's most certainly true that the complex traditions of such societies will be simplified within a larger world history course due to time constraints. However, even a simplified form of this history will form awareness in students and potentially spark interest, which could lead students to seek out more specialized knowledge about civilizations such as China. The lack of a paradigm should not hold historians back from creating a new system, a system that can go beyond the concept of the West and the rest, in which teachers tackle on aspects of world history while primarily focusing on the West. These areas of study deserve separate platforms. The primary reason behind the argument for improved world history programs at the higher education level is exposure. Becoming more globally minded citizens is important, but there's more to it than that. Most students of history, unless they go out of their way to take advanced placement world history in high school, probably will not have had much, if any, exposure to world history before the higher education level. Without this exposure, they will never know if they are missing out on a potential passion. Whether students choose to go more in depth on these topics later remains up to them, but it's important that they are exposed to the option. Without a requirement, many students will avoid such a survey, which is a loss to their historical education. While colleges and universities alter the history curricula to include these more diverse course options, they should place an equal focus on weaving more hands-on research into courses from the start of a history major's career. In the past, most history curricula have relied on a pyramidal structure, moving from broad surveys lacking much research to specified seminar courses featuring a higher focus on research. This system makes sense to an extent, but it denies history students the opportunity to closely engage with information until the final semesters of their studies. At the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, Sarah Jorgensen, quote, wanted to make clear that studying history involves the development of a set of intellectual tools that allows scholars to assess and make sense of information. She set out to teach these students that the process of doing history is about making and defending factually grounded arguments, and that this skill set has very broad applications. Asking questions, analyzing information, and defending arguments are vital skills for historians to have, and should be taught to history majors from the beginning. Unfortunately, many history majors do not encounter these skills until the final leg of their education. It is only then in some kind of seminar class that students experience the process so familiar to historians, generally identifying questions, selecting sources, pursuing arguments, and then creating multiple drafts of a written work. This system does a disservice to history majors. If students wait until the final courses of their college education to engage in research methods, they will not have the opportunity to learn from mistakes and improve their skills as researchers. Methods of research and historiography should be introduced from the start. This way, students will learn the techniques and then apply them to increasingly more complicated subjects as their educations continue. Research methods will teach students the skills for comparing cultures and learning from historical trends rather than simply memorizing data. History curricula at the higher education level demand revamping. Colleges and universities must work to shift their curricula in order to increase student potential for making comparisons, gaining a global understanding, and developing research skills. World History Survey courses should be a requirement along with U.S. and Western civilization courses in order to both expand global awareness among history students and expose these students to previously unknown information. Such requirements will not pull away from the traditional focus on the West, but will instead offer an alternative perspective and give a voice to the many other cultures of the world. Although the history of the entire world is certainly broad, such vastness of information should not deter professors from teaching it at all. The field of history places an emphasis on the past, but its curriculum must look to the future. A stronger emphasis on diverse subject matters and research skills will turn history majors into historians prepared to interact with our global world. Thank you.
Questions, both of the four scholars who presented and also of the other scholars whose abstracts you can find in your handbooks.
Hi, so I have a question for Ken. I actually wrote a fairly similar paper for my junior Ford paper last year titled Academic Writing for Intellectuals, and how there's like this gap between what we put out and what the public perceives. And at the end of your abstracts here, you notice, or you note that you will attempt to talk about the ways that we as intellectuals can bridge that gap. So I was just wondering, like, what would you tell an intellectual person what to to say to somebody who is both anti-intellectual as well as a-intellectual if they come across them on a daily basis?
I'm going to try to answer your question with a little bit of a story. And it's a story that all of us know very well, and it was deciding on the name of the Ford Forum. So our name is for the forum is Awakened: A New Hope for Education. An earlier version of our title was Endangered with an ED at the end. Which I liked much better because I'm a bit of a pessimist. However, Professor Johnson suggested a more hopeful outlook. So that's a tough, it's a tough bridge to get. And I don't have a quick and easy answer for that. I'm not. I haven't actually written any peer-reviewed articles that are able to communicate with the general public. I'm sorry. Do you have a suggestion?
If this is a discussion, I will take some time to talk about what I talked about. I personally actually serendipitously had met somebody at a conference like 2 weeks before the paper was due. And we were at the airport, and he was looking for a cab, and I was looking for a cab, and there was one cab, and he was like, you know what, hop in. You going to the conference? I was like, sure. So it turns out this guy is doing research on like harmful algal blooms in Wisconsin. And he actually has his research students, rather than present at a conference, well, they present at a conference as well, but he actually has them go out into local coffee shops with their posters that they present at the conference and present it to the public about how, you know, like using fertilizers in that area of the country will run off into the Great Lakes and cause like fish die-offs and health problems and stuff like that. And that was one of the ways. Another one of the ways was actually the Scientific Outreach Club that a colleague of mine, I started with Dr. Conrad and Dr. Bonner, and this weekend we had a brunch with ASPEC members to talk about the Nobel Prizes and kind of their implications. So I was just wondering if you had like any additional experiences about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many problems that go into it, because how do you get people to listen? And in today's age, it's much more difficult, because those people who are aggressively wrong have so much, their voices are so much louder than they ever have been in the past. There's just an echo chamber on the internet that creates polarization and radicalism. So, I mean, I would say encyclopedia articles, but nobody reads those. Yeah, I don't have a good answer.
What about zoos? I think that's a serious question for Joy to join in with the conversation. I mean, is that a good example of trying to take knowledge out into the world?
I'd like to say so, but the main issue with zoos, obviously, is kind of the controversy that's really surrounding them, is there's always going to be this balancing act of how much are you going to put out to really interact with society and get them engaged without that cost of like the animal welfare and such. And so that's a big thing that zoos are trying to balance, is how much space are they going to give these animals to be able to roam around but still be able to engage the public with. And so in every single situation, especially at zoos, there's always going to be a balancing act of what can you do to engage the public, but at the same time, what is that going to cost? If that makes sense.
I
relates to all this, but Ken mentioned mistrust several times in your paper, but I think that also plays into the anti-intellectual and the zoos. Like, where does that mistrust come from when you're intellectual, or you're, a professor or a scientist, and you're trying to communicate? I'm just really genuinely curious, where do you guys see that? Mistrust seems to be an issue in several of the papers.
There's a lot of misinformation. Ken mentioned the internet, and in one of my other classes, we're looking a lot into right now, like the misinformation campaigns run by the Russians, which are very extensive and part of like an active hybrid warfare. And so they have hundreds of thousands of people actively spreading false information on the internet.
Well, why do people trust the internet but not scientists?
You can say you're a scientist on the internet.
It's because people only listen to who they want to listen to. They find the people that agree with them, and then they discuss with each other, and that's how the radicalization of the views happen.
Also, Olivia's
I think a big part of the mistrust comes from the fact that a lot of scientific information just isn't in terms that people can understand, and so you have to just take what they say and what scientists say and accept it, and I think that that's a problem. A lot of people don't want to do that, and that's why it is so important that scientists learn to communicate with the layman and learn to relate their research and their findings to things that everybody cares about, the things that specific parties care about. Yeah, and I think that would make it a lot easier for a lot of people to trust what scientists say if they can somehow understand what it's about and where it comes from and why it matters.
We were also talking out of my classes very recently about the way that people are naturally only wanting to read new information from what they already know. So that if that is the norm for how to absorb new information, if you don't have a way of absorbing new information because you're just so anti or intellectual, then your next reaction is just going to be to not try to absorb it at all. And lacking the trust in something can be a very big reason to rationalize why it's okay for you to not absorb this new information.
Hi, I have a question for Sarah. I was a history major in the 90s when many of these discussions were taking place. And it's before my time, but I understand it, Eckerd in the 90s, there was much debate about how the human experience course, which was called something else back then, it was called Western Civilization, Western Heritage, whatever it was before. I wonder how you think what your research has done might be applied to something like human experience at Eckerd, and how might we make that a more global and inclusive course?
Something I would say from my personal experience in human experience is that I feel like it is still very geared towards the West, which I think maybe fits its previous name better. So I think there are a lot of students who have issues with history and think it's very boring and don't want to study it. So if there were ways to incorporate more, even if it was like historical background for the different books that we're reading, etc., that could maybe start to spark more interest in people to then take like history electives later on in their college career. So, and I think that's something that's usually easy to do because most authors have some sort of like historical background either within their lives or how that affects their work and whatnot.
So this is for any of the panelists, but it seems like one of the strategies for targeting this distrust of intellectualism is to really focus on critical thinking. Because then, as you're presented information on the internet out in the real world, you're better equipped to evaluate it thoughtfully. And so I'm wondering, in your own experiences as students, just thinking about these issues, how do you think we should tackle this issue of tackling critical thinking? Because I know it's incorporated into most of our courses as a sort of secondary goal, but there's not necessarily a lot of courses that tackle it as the primary topic.
So in my paper, I talked a lot. I can't see you. Where are you? Okay. So in my paper, I talked a lot about including ethical conversation in STEM education. So kind of the idea, I mean, and it works, I think, across all disciplines, is bringing in this idea that everything we talk about and learn in school impacts us and is part of how we see ourselves in the world, obviously. So I think bringing in those ethical conversations and not saying that that's something that you decide at home, like acknowledging that our education impacts who we are as individuals and how we see ourselves and how we see the world around us is a good place because everyone can relate to it and it makes us feel like this is relevant to me and this is shaping me. Just one way.
I think another big factor in that goes along with your point is giving students responsibility and treating them like they're responsible entities, which we don't have a lot of opportunity for in our mass education system. I know I went to a lot of, in my own experience, a lot of small charter schools where I got to have, you know, responsibility for a camera while I went out to take pictures, and those little bits of responsibility just make you more aware of yourself and the fact that you do have an opinion that you should be critically, you know, evaluating.
I had a question for Ciaran originally, but it seems like it sort of spread to everybody. Ciaran, in your paper, Politicized Science, you seem to suggest that an introduction of more STEM-based lawmakers into Congress, or even we could extrapolate that to local governments, would help to bring about a change in discourse regarding scientific topics like climate change or whatever else may go on. But in a democratic society like ours, where we elect our politicians and we are increasingly selecting what truth we want to believe in, is that really a viable solution? Or could the majority just tune out the scientists?
I think it depends on what you allocate, or like what you think the cause is. I think that there isn't much encouragement of people to be interested in science and political science simultaneously. There are some people who are like trying to put it out there. People like Neil deGrasse Tyson who are trying to get and normal people who are trying to get people without a scientific education to get interested in it. And personally, I think that it's not a matter of getting people to elect scientists. It's a matter of having tracks that encourages people interested in science to also be interested in political science. And there isn't really much of that. Like, for example, maybe every once in a while someone might be like, oh, you're into science, maybe you could do science policy or something like that. But it's never, maybe like you could, become a lawmaker or something like that. So I don't think it's a demand side problem so much as a supply side problem.
Hi, and thank you all for your papers. I wanted to ask, I think Aisling and Grace in particular, maybe to return to this question of anti-intellectualism and mistrust, to maybe reflect on some broader social and political context, and I guess more the question of sort of who gets to be educated. Aisling, you mentioned a question of the perpetuation of a class system, and Grace, you were talking about discrimination in education. So I wonder if maybe some of those factors and dimensions might enter into this in some way.
I guess I'll start it off. I, in my paper, discussed kind of the social construct that exists around those who do choose to go to a four-year institution for their higher education, and the differences between their measure of success, and those who choose not to take a gap year or to take some alternative path. And so specifically focusing on those who do get educated, those who choose to either return to it later in life. I think that mistrust can come from the social stigma surrounding those who went back to school or took an alternative path to school, that somehow their idea of education didn't match up with the socially accepted ideas, and therefore they know less, therefore they understand less, therefore they are not as educated as anyone else. And so that can feed into this mistrust of the experts, depending on how someone came about their education.
I think that the mistrust and then also anti-intellectualism is kind of coinciding with the accessibility of education, and I talked about discrimination more of kind of combating it, but definitely it's not accessible to always be able to reach that intellectualism. So I know that Shannon talked about that in her paper as well, but I was kind of more talking about how in order to be able to level the playing field of accessibility and education in general, we need to start educating the youth about discrimination and kind of giving them tools to combat it at a younger age, so that we can have that paradigm shift, and then kind of add to the intellectualism that you were talking about.
So I had a question for Madeline. As somebody who is a graduating senior, I have a lot of anxiety coming up about going into the real world and like finding a place to live and, like having food and stuff. So I understand where your argument is coming from. On the flip side, I feel as though like something that's already fostered within higher education, especially an institution like this, is critical thinking and problem solving. And so I was just wondering how you think that like co-ops and internships add to our ability to problem solve our way through real world topics like groceries or something like that.
Well, in my paper, I definitely address how the liberal arts education does provide us with what I call, or not me, what scholars have called intellectual autonomy, which relates to what Ken's paper was about, and the ability to think critically. And the idea of a work semester or a co-op only adds to that. It's inspired by, I took time off to work full-time and saw personal growth in myself that I wouldn't have normally seen if I had stayed here. But I think that co-ops, where you leave school to work full-time for a company or otherwise, and are in charge of your own housing and food and finances, provides unique opportunities to work through problems related to people. I think that we're always in places where we're with people our own age, often in liberal arts schools, people with the same like socioeconomic backgrounds and even political ideologies, and so there isn't as much conflict as maybe there would be in the real world. So we are given opportunities to go out and exist on our own and maybe even flounder a little bit. We gain the skills that then when we return back to school we can improve upon them before we are released into the wild for real. So.
I believe we have time for just one more question.
So my question is for Sarah LeFebvre. You're in the back there. What would be one thing you would change about our service learning office? Kind of
The one at
big, yeah, Eckerd's.
So my paper really focuses on there's a lack of information out there about whether or not service learning is truly beneficial to the community organizations that we're working with. And so a couple of really good options that they were saying might help. First is maybe
see the connections, especially with people working with children. They said they don't really like that for just short-term service because the kids get really attached, and then all of a sudden these people that they know and they're working with, they're gone, and they don't really get an explanation for that. So maybe even thinking about different ways in which service, even short-term service, is not necessarily just 20 hours and you're done. You can get that done in the first half of the semester. Figuring out a way to really expand that over the entire semester, maybe not necessarily just like giving a limited number of service hours that they can get done very easily, but tracking when they can do that service over the semester in order to keep these individuals engaged with these community organizations for the amount of time that these organizations sign up to have these people working with them. I think that would be a really good way to, at least to start bridging this divide where these organizations feel like they're not getting the same taken as these students are.
Thank you for your insightful questions. We will now welcome Diego to have some closing remarks.
Good evening, everybody. I should like to thank my colleagues, as well as you, the audience, for an inspired and marvelous discourse. As was hopefully demonstrated, the Fords have devoted much time to tackling very serious issues of the modern day, relating to social inequity, educational pedagogy, and intellectual culture. It is our sincere hope to not only discuss these issues amongst ourselves, however, but rather to open them into a public forum with which we may speak and hopefully enact change with others. As was suggested by the eminent pedagogue Paulo Freire, in order to enact change, we must wed theory with action. We must seek praxis. If we are to truly act as the beacons for a new hope in education, we cannot afford to do any less. And so tonight is as much an invitation to this forum as it is to action. In addition, there's a subject I very dearly want to address. You might be curious as to why we chose a Star Wars theme for our Ford Forum. And trust me, as was alluded by my colleague Ken, anyone viewing the planning process for this forum would definitely have seen a battle of Star Wars proportions. Minus the droids, minus the lightsabers and the lasers. But underlying the mythology of Star Wars are themes that we all came to concur are indispensable wisdom and value. The Star Wars universe is one that is characterized by its diversity, vibrancy, and complex social relationships. Heroes and villains of the light side and the dark side of the Force square off in literal battles that stake their lives, but also ethical conflicts that are far more complex than the simple binary would imply. We are invited into a world that is in a constant state of flux, perpetually missing the limit of balance among the many contesting forces. And yet, at the core of this narrative, characters are taken under the wing of knowledgeable, if not a bit quirky, mentors who offer forth guidance. Star Wars implicitly affirms the value of this guidance, the importance of finding a cause worth fighting for, and the hope that one can exact change that has far-reaching consequences. And thus, it is with a humble and happy hearts we accept the next generation of mentors in Ford's College to join us in this mission. May the Fords be with you, and you be with your fellow Fords. Thank you all for coming tonight, and if I may, I would like to invite you all to the President's Dining Room for refreshments and light conversation.